Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Baltes Lecture 2020. My name is Zoe Ngo, and I will help guide you through the event today, together with my co-moderator, Martin Dahl. The annual Baltes Lecture was initiated to commemorate Paul Baltes' achievements in psychological research and his tremendous contributions to augmenting collaboration among institutes in the Berlin-Potsdam area. The lecture series is hosted by the Free University of Berlin, the Humboldt University of Berlin, the Technical University of Berlin, and the University of Berlin of Potsdam, in collaboration with the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. This lecture series is supported by the Margret and Paul Baltes Foundation for the advancement of research in lifespan psychology and gerontology. We are beyond thrilled that the Baltes Lecture 2020 will be delivered by Professor Nora Newcombe. I've had the honor to call Nora my mentor for over 7 years now. She is an inspiration and the lighthouse to my scientific pursuits. So I'm extremely excited that she's here with us today. Before we begin, I want to bring your attention to the general setup of today's event. After my brief remarks, Professor Umen Lindenberger, Director of the Center for Lifespan Psychology at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, will open the lecture with the introduction to our speaker. After Professor Newcombe's lecture, we will have time for an open discussion. So if you have any questions, please use the chat option on our control panel. The questions will be collected and organized by my co-moderator, Martin Dahl, and we will give you the opportunity to directly address your questions to Professor Newcombe by opening your audio. Please be aware that this talk will be recorded and made available to the public via the YouTube channel of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. So if you would like to not have your voice recorded and to have questions or comments during the Q&A, please only use the chat function instead of speaking up. So in this case, please indicate in the chat that you prefer the moderator to read out your questions. Okay, now without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Umen Lindenberger for his introduction.
Thank you, Zoe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, dear Nora, dear guests on your laptops, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Paul B. Baltes Lecture and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Nora Newcombe from Temple University. Before I do so, I would like to say a few words about this lecture series in general. Paul B. Baltes has been the director of the Lifespan Center for Lifespan Psychology at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development since the early 80s. When he passed away in late 2006 at the age of 67, there was a heartfelt consensus among colleagues from psychology in Berlin and neighboring Potsdam to honor his memory. It was in this vein that Peter French, the current vice president for research at Humboldt University, brought up the idea of a lecture series in his name. The motivation for the series is twofold. First, we want to commemorate Paul as the eminent scientist who has established lifespan psychology as a distinct conceptual approach within developmental psychology. Second, we wish to celebrate Paul's achievements for psychology in Berlin and Potsdam. Paul was a passionate, creative, and effective networker and institution builder, and his efforts and ideas have strengthened psychology as an academic discipline in the Berlin-Potsdam research area. This, as Zoe has already said, is reflected by the institutional arrangement of the series, which is hosted by 5 institutions: the Free University Berlin, the Humboldt University of Berlin, the Technical University Berlin, the University of Potsdam, and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. The scientific host is rotating annually among the 5 partner institutions, and this year the MPI for Human Development is serving as the virtual host institution for Nora. The lecture series was inaugurated in 2008 in the context of the International Congress of Psychology. Mike Posner was the one who held that first lecture with several thousand people attending. Since 2009, the lecture has taken place at the Leibniz Hall of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, arguably the most prestigious and beautiful lecture venue in Berlin. After the end of the lecture, we always would have a reception, which was sponsored by the Margret and Paul Baltes Foundation. In fact, every year, the reception is a welcome opportunity to exchange ideas, chat about recent developments, and simply have a glass of wine and a good time together. So when it became clear that we cannot have a Baltes lecture in person this year, our initial reaction was to simply let it be and cancel the entire event. But then we thought, let's do something different, something that has its own merits and is more than just a substitute. Let's try to reach as many of our colleagues around the globe and turn this into a virtual highlight of the year. So it is in this vein and in recognition of the fact that science, other than scientists, has no boundaries and that it can continue to travel around the world with no restrictions, that I would like to introduce this year's speaker, the Laura H. Carnell Professor of Psychology at Temple University, Dr. Nora Newcombe. Nora was educated at Antioch College, where she graduated with a major in psychology, and at Harvard University, where she received her PhD in psychology and social relations. She taught previously at Penn State University and currently serves as president of the International Mind-Brain Education Society, as past president of the Federation of Associations in Brain and Behavioral Sciences, as editor of Psychological Science in the Public Interest, and as associate editor of the journal Cognitive Research, Principles and Implications. Her honors include the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the Society for Research and Child Development, the William James Fellow Award from APS, the Howard Crosby Warren Medal from the Society of Experimental Psychologists, the George Miller Award and the Stanley Hall Awards from APA, the Award for Distinguished Service to Psychological Science, also from APA, and the Women in Cognitive Science Mentor Award. She is a fellow of 4 divisions of the American Psychological Association: General, Experimental, Developmental, and Psychology of Women, of the Association for Psychological Science, and of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She has been a visiting professor of the University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, the University of Otago, and the Berlin Center for Advanced Studies called Wissenschaftskolleg. Nora's research focuses are on spatial cognition and development, with an emphasis on the development of autobiographical and episodic memory. In recent years, she has become interested in understanding the nature, development, and malleability of spatial skills that facilitate learning in domains that we typically subsume under STEM: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. She is currently an advisory board member of the NSF-funded Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center and co-directs both the Temple Infant and Child Laboratory and the Research and Spatial Cognition Lab. Throughout her work, Nora has been advocating what she has termed a neo-constructivist approach to cognitive development and to cognition in general. I highly recommend reading her 2011 article in Child Development Perspectives, where she lists 8 basic tenets and portrays neo-constructivism as a big tent, I cite, as a big tent that can cover many more specific schools of thought. Dear Nora, we are glad that you will show us around in this spacious tent and look forward to your talk, Affordances and Representations, Understanding Mental Rotation, Perspective Taking, and Spatial Orientation. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Ulman, for the invitation and for the introduction, which is actually a perfect introduction, because indeed today what I want to talk about is exactly that big tent. And to do that, I actually want to explain what these images on the slide mean to me. There's a picture here of Paul Baltes, who I imagine most of you recognize. This lecture is in his honor. And I actually knew him. I overlapped as an assistant professor in psychology when he was in the College of Human Development at Penn State. And in the context of it being the Baltes Lecture, you may be wondering about the title, Affordances and Representations. I think Paul would have taken it for granted that people have representations. He talked about aging as having wisdom, for instance. So I don't think that was controversial for him. But there are people in psychology, famous theorists, such as this woman that I'm showing here, Eleanor Gibson, Jackie Gibson, who took a very different view and who talked about affordances. So the title of this lecture actually had its origin in that I was supposed to be giving a Gibson lecture last spring at Cornell, which would have been thrilling, and I wanted to talk about the Gibson's impact on psychology. It was canceled, and maybe it'll be rescheduled either in person or virtually. But given this opportunity, I thought it would be nice to explain this big tent in the context of, on the one hand, Jackie Gibson studied infants and very young kids. Paul Baltes was interested in the aging. Jackie was interested in perception, and Paul in real knowledge. But I think that together with many other theorists, they've forged an overall theoretical understanding that we can make use of today. And I want to explain this overall neo-constructivist way of thinking in the context of talking about mental rotation, perspective taking, and spatial reorientation. So middle picture down here below is perspective taking. You can kind of recognize Piaget's 3 mountains. At the left, you may be thinking, well, that's not mental rotation. This child is actually rotating a circle with his finger. And that's where affordances come in. The circle affords rolling. So we're going to take a look at how affordances, in my view, become representations. And then spatial reorientation, which I will define later, is about navigation. So this is the cover of what I think is a wonderful children's book, Lucy in the City, about an animal who gets lost in the city and finds her way. So let's begin by thinking about developmental theory, because I want to do a broad brush overview of the way I think about it. This is actually from Wires in Cognitive Science in 2013, but it's very much taking up on the themes that Ullman mentioned that I introduced in 2011. I think it's hard for people outside cognitive development to really believe or to understand to what extent modern thinking and cognitive development is still wound up in the nativist empiricist controversy. So what I was trying to do in this table was to contrast modern nativism here on the left and a modern empiricism here on the right with a middle road that I'm here calling modern constructivism, which you can see shares certain attributes with nativism. So it believes in strong starts, not weak starts, a representational way of thinking about adult knowledge, not a non-representational way. But like empiricism, it gives a pretty major role in development to the environment and sees the child as going through substantial change. I think uniquely among the 3 ways of thinking, it's really an active organism theory. Empiricism, you're kind of at the mercy of the environment. Nativism, you're at the mercy of your biology. I realize that's a little bit of a caricature, but there we go. So I'm going to use this way of thinking to go through modern constructivism and illustrate these themes of strong starting points and major change by looking at mental rotation and perspective taking. And then another theme, which is how we parse the mind, how we think about what's truly related, not just seems to be related on the surface. And I'll do that with reference to perspective taking and to spatial reorientation. So first, these broad themes, and I want to bring together some of my sort of heroes from the past. First of all, there's Darwin. And I want to say that I think everyone today, pretty much, maybe you could present me with an exception or two, is a Darwinist. So that all of our theorizing in contemporary cognitive development is really within this kind of evolutionary as well as developmental perspective. And I say no one approach occupies the Darwinian high ground, basically because I don't think that the term blank slate ought to be applied to anyone today. So you may recognize a sort of subtweet. I'll make it a real tweet. Steve Pinker is fond of talking about the blank slate, but I basically don't think that's fair. Here's another person, Bill Greeno, who introduced the idea of experience expectancy, which is the idea that biology is important, but not necessarily in terms of giving us inborn knowledge, that instead nature could solve the problem of how we're going to construct our knowledge by endowing us with a neural architecture that would inevitably learn from the expectable input in the environment that they're going to encounter, what they need to learn. So you don't have to wire in specific content to see it universally appear in a predictable sequence. Now, it could be wired in, it's kind of an empirical question, but it doesn't have to be wired in. Now we come to the Gibsons. There's a picture not just of Eleanor, but also her husband, James Gibson. And in instantiating the idea of experience expectancy, it's important to realize that the world is very well equipped with various kinds of perceptual redundancies and correlations among attributes that allow us to learn more quickly than we would be able to learn if there were not those redundancies and correlations. So I think we can go beyond the Gibsonian assertion that you somehow pick up information to begin to quantify input, how much of what kind, and then we can specify ways in which the child learns. And of course, that takes us to the Reverend Bayes and the modern work on statistical learning and Bayesian thinking. And this kind of approach, in my mind, addresses one of the key arguments of nativism, which always goes like this: you can't learn by any kind of associationism because there's so many associations, you could never converge on the correct ones. I think if you adopt the perspective that I'm trying to build here, you probably can converge on the correct ones, although again, that's an empirical question. Here we have Jeff Ellman and Liz Bates, who together with others wrote a book that I very, very, very much admire, which coined the phrase interactions all the way down, which speaks to the perspective that I've been trying to advance, which is this richly structured world and this capacity for probabilistic experience expectant reasoning. Interact and integrate multiple cues to draw conclusions and to build knowledge and to build representations. Now, you may have been wondering why I haven't mentioned Piaget, and here we finally do get to Piaget, who argued that action plays a key role in development, and I think that's true. There are modern versions of the primacy of action, but Piaget first drew our attention to that. And he meant by that more than embodied cognition. He meant physical action, but he also meant active organism action, cognitive action. So basically, it's what the social psychologists call dissonance reduction, the idea of making sense, that we are born with, and probably other animals are also born with, this need to make predictions that come true, to make sense of the world, and we'll adjust our expectancies in order to have that come true. This is a person you may not recognize, Sheldon White, Shep White, who was one of my professors at Harvard. And back in the 70s, people were saying, well, development is nothing like learning. There was that old boring learning theory, and that has nothing to do with development. But Shep always said that development is learning, except it's learning as the learner changes. And so there's now many examples of this, the kind of perceptual tuning that Janet Worker has shown us occurs in the first year, the formation of the shape bias, which Linda Smith and Barbara Lando has studied, and those kinds of changes create a fundamentally altered learner. So development and learning go hand in hand. We have Linda Smith at the bottom and also Esther Thielen, who also resolved a long-standing controversy in thinking about development, at least solved it in my mind, the quantitative-qualitative fight, by arguing that it really depends on the granularity of observation. So viewed from sort of above, viewed from a distance, developmental change definitely looks qualitative. The 2-year-old is nothing like the 16-year-old. But quantitatively, day by day by day, when you do granular observation and when you're concerned about mechanism, you can see change. And then we have Aristotle. When people argue about cause and mechanism, often they're arguing because they aren't thinking about all 4 kinds of Aristotelian cause at once. So you need to do description, and developmentalists are very fond of what anthropologists call thick description, really, really detailed observation. And I think this is very important. But we also have increasingly knowledge about the neural substrate that develops. We think within this Darwinian context about evolution and adaptation. And then we, at the sort of granularity of observation mechanism level, we want to think about how the input interacts with the neural substrate and the current state of the learner to create change. So I think when we work those kinds of themes together, we end up with a modern constructivism that does, now I've highlighted it in red, talk about strong starting points as nativism would, but also about major change, which I think is rare in nativism, although I'll return to that theme a little bit when we talk about spatial reorientation. First, let's look at mental rotation. So Piaget did do some work on mental rotation. He said that it was late in the sense of it didn't appear until childhood. Piaget sort of thought everything appeared late, but the ways he studied it were not in tune with modern cognitive psychology. Starting in the early 70s, so 50 years ago now, Roger Shepard and in this experiment Jackie Metzler introduced the very, at this point, I think to all, even if you don't study mental rotation, paradigm where you think about whether these block structures can be rotated to be congruent or whether one is a mirror image of the other. And what they documented and what's been seen probably literally thousands of times since is that there's a linear increase with angle of rotation in how long it takes you to make a decision. So you basically are rotating it back in your mind. What the child was doing in rolling the circle, you're doing in your mind. Now, because Piaget said that that didn't appear until late, in the late 70s and then again in the late 90s, people took up the gauntlet and thought, well, maybe Piaget was wrong. This was very much a theme of the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Maybe young kids can actually do it. And in the 1977 experiment by Gloria Marmer, using these ice cream cones and bears, which were or were not mirror images, what she found was that there was this kind of linear relationship between angular discrepancy and reaction time for adults, for 5-year-olds, also for 4-year-olds. Now, you can see that the slope for 4-year-olds is very steep and that it starts at a really slow speed and that there's enormous standard error bars. And in addition, Marmer rejected quite a lot of the 4-year-olds for failure to even be able to complete the experiment. So what I think we don't know is quite if those 4-year-olds can do it. So hold that thought. At this point, though, I want to talk about the idea of embodied representation and whether, to the extent that 5-year-olds can do this task, and I think we saw in Marmer result that 5-year-olds probably can pretty well do it, are they doing it in the same way as older children and adults? And this is work from Andrea Frick, who's pictured here at the top. She was doing doctoral work at the University of Zurich. She's now at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. So what she did was to do an experiment with 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 11-year-olds, and adults. You can see that the 5-year-olds here are showing these very slow response times. They are showing these angular relationships with stimulus orientation. You can barely see them with the older children and the adults because the y-axis gets so stretched by the need to represent the 5-year-old data. But what's even more interesting is that these people were having to do the mental rotation task while they also turned a crank under the table. And they would turn it either in the direction that they would be rotating the object that they wanted to decide, oh, is it the same or is it a mirror image, or in the opposite direction, which would be, of course, incompatible. And what she found was that it didn't make any difference to the 11-year-olds and the adults. But for the 5-year-olds and for the 8-year-olds, it really did make a difference, suggesting that at 5 and even at 8, they are still using these motor processes to perform mental rotation, which is a very Piagetian idea. It's the idea of embodied cognition, but disappearing into a more mental or more cognitive representation. Now, even adults, though, probably do have some residues of this kind of embodied representation, in that when you do fMRI studies, you sometimes do see activation in sensory motor parts of the brain. Not always, and it depends, but you sometimes do. So even adults probably do this to some extent. When Andrea came to work with me as a postdoc, we thought we'd have a whack at whether or not these 4- and 5-year-olds were really able to do mental rotation. We wanted actually to be able to have a good test of mental rotation. So we did our best, first with these kinds of figures at various orientations. And what we found is that 4-year-olds were not really above chance. We didn't really select our 4-year-olds to the extent that Marmer selected her 4-year-olds. And the 5-year-olds were above chance, but their performance is not very impressive. 5-year-olds do show some linear relationships with angular disparity, although they're not as smooth and beautiful as Shepard and Metzler's, but the 4-year-olds do not. And the error rates are linear, if maybe not impressively linear, but statistically significantly for the 5-year-olds and not for the 4-year-olds. So maybe not till 5, right? But we tried again. We tried with these, I think, very cute ghosts, which come in either these forms or mirror image ghosts. And we thought maybe this is more engaging, they'll like it better. We tried it both in a virtual form and in a paper version, and we found very similar results. We bravely tried 3-year-olds, 3.5-year-olds who couldn't do it at all. These 4.5-year-olds were above chance, the 5.5-year-olds even more above chance. When you look at the relationships with angular disparity, only the 5-year-olds are showing any kinds of effects in terms of percent correct going down with angular disparity. And overall, the picture that we put together from these studies is 3.5- and 4-year-olds cannot succeed, 4.5- and 5-year-olds, a little bit, and 5.5-year-olds are beginning to get it. So one of the reasons I'm going into depth on this is that this conclusion sits very uneasily with some findings from infants. So let's go back and look at, well, what are the strong starting points? And then we can look at the puzzle of how do these starting points potentially transform into the 3- and 4-year-old who can't really do standard mental rotation and who eventually become able to do it at 6 or so, although maybe through 8 or so in a way that's different from the way that adults do it. So there are various studies. One goes back to the late 90s. Sue Hespes and Philippe Rochat showed babies of 4 or 6 months, this kind of wrench that turns as it goes behind a screen and then is revealed either to show where you think it would have been or actually how did it twist so fast, and who reacted when it was shown in the orientation that was improbable. And then there were simultaneously appearing back-to-back in psychological science, 2 studies, one from Moore and Johnson using Shepard-Metzler-like block figures, but with colors, and another one from Paul Quinn and Lynn Libben showing figures like this sort of number 1 are systematically changing over time and then appearing in test trials, either in mirror image or not mirror image configurations. And they found, Hespes and Rashah had not found sex differences, but Moore and Johnson and Quinn and Libben both found that male infants reacted to improbable mirror image block structures or number 1s, and female infants did not. So there was both some impression of strong starting points, but there was also this idea that only the boys had it, which of course fits pretty well with the fact that men are typically better at these tests than women are, and actually stakes out a pretty strong kind of biological position. So I want to take you through some lovely work that Andrea Frick did with her colleague at Zurich, Wenke Möhring, who is now at Basel and who later came also to be a postdoc with me, addressed the puzzle of why you can find, maybe only with boy infants or maybe with all infants, these kind of looking time results with babies, whereas you don't find success at 3, 4, and maybe even 5 years with older children. And this is a puzzle that Rachel Keene called something like, why are toddlers so dumb if babies are so smart? Which is kind of a rude way of saying what I'm trying to say. So is it just about looking at looking times versus looking at having to make an explicit choice? Or is it the fact that these prior infant experiments showed blocks or whatever in a lot of different orientations? So to react to the improbable ones, you only had to either extrapolate or interpolate between what you had seen. Whereas the older children and the adults have to absolutely just imagine or predict the mental rotation. So here's a picture of Wenke. Yeah, I said she's now back in Switzerland in Basel. And they did this experiment with things like this kind of letter P or letter Q. And these figures would be flat and blue on one side and 3-dimensional and red and yellow on the other side. And they would just go up and down. But then the hand would twist while the figure was behind the cover. And then it would reemerge either with what could be reemerging, which is the upside down, say, flat P, or with something that was impossible. Now, the kids did know, the babies did know that there was the one side and the other side because they had been shown that. They had been shown it in one of 2 ways. They had either been allowed to manually explore it. Here you see a child about to grasp, and 6-month-olds have this very awkward grasp, but this kid is going to get it, manage to grasp it. The P and the side that's facing the baby would be the yellow and red side. Or they had merely observed the 2 sides because there was a glass in between experimenter holding the 2P and the mom holding the baby. And I think you can see this baby really, really wants to hold this lovely toy, holding his or her hands up to the glass, but is unable to hold and manipulate it. And what Möhring and Frick were able to show is that 6-month-olds could succeed, but only if they had explored. So this is kind of a strong starting point, but it's not as strong as, say, Moore and Johnson or Quinn and Libben. And maybe that's because the babies did have to have an internal representation. And it's not as strong in that they could only do it if they had this first-hand motor knowledge, which is very Piagetian, or possibly Gibsonian, but it definitely emphasizes action. Now, they also ran this experiment with 8-month-olds who could not do it in the observation condition. But by 10 months of age, babies were able to succeed even when they did not get to touch and handle the stimulus. Andrea actually did a prior postdoc to when she came to me at UC Santa Cruz with Suhua Wong, and did an experiment with older toddlers that was similar but different. So now we have a more complicated stimulus. We have this kind of duck, and it's on a turntable. So you can turn the turntable, or the experimenter can turn the turntable, and that can be done with a cover in place, so you don't get to see how the duck is going to turn. Then the duck can be shown either in the sort of view of the duck that you ought to be able to see, given how much it was turned, or in some other impossible view. And here you see an echo of what Murring and Frick had observed with babies. That is, here's this action condition with a toddler doing the spinning, and here's an observation condition where the turntable is beyond the toddler's reach. You can see the toddler would like to turn this, but is unable to. And the experimenter demonstrates and handles the spinning. And what you can see is that the magic, that is, you should not be able to see the duck head on like this. You should be seeing the duck from the side. And the 13 to 14-month-olds who get to act themselves, who get to turn the turntable, realize that the duck should not be viewed from the front. If they only observe it, they don't see the difference. And this is another group from a prior experiment that did nothing but observation. And actually that result went in the other direction, although it was not significant. So that kind of reassured everyone that this was a truly non-significant effect, and then going the other way, even if it was non-significant, was irrelevant. So what we may see is that again and again over development, as things get a little bit more complex and a little bit more demanding, you need to have firsthand action in order to succeed. And even, as I said before, with adults, as you get a difficult mental rotation task, you may overtly activate your motor, you're kind of going mentally to do mental rotation tasks. So this is actually a Piagetian interiorization of action that I think is an important general principle in development, as we see affordances and action-based representations becoming cognitive interiorized representations. Now you may be thinking, oh, what happened to those sex differences? Well, I don't know what's up with the sex differences in babies. Those sometimes appear and sometimes don't. And we don't have a meta-analysis now, so I'm kind of agnostic as to whether they exist. But recently we have seen a meta-analysis of the KID data from Lauer, Yang, and Lourenco that appeared last year in Psych Bulletin. And it's very clear that sex differences grow in size from the age of 3 years, when I would argue they're zero, basically because we can't even measure mental rotation. But they're pretty much zero even when they do start to be able to measure mental rotation. And they go up to, this shows that at about a half or above a half standard deviation as measured by Hedges G. You can find some that are 3/4 or 1 standard deviation. Okay, so what are the conclusions at this point? At 6 months, babies can recognize a violation, even when they have not seen an object in these multiple orientations. But experience seems to propel developmental change, and it seems to do this again and again in repeated cycles as you are encountering more and more challenging situations. In terms of being able to actually make predictions without any action, without seeing anything, and affirmatively make judgments, not just react to, that looks weird, versus, oh yeah, that seems sensible. Actively choosing the correct solution, you can't really do that to 5 to 6 years. And even then, it's depending on this embodied kind of representation. So in terms of three kinds of developmental theory, I think we do see some strong starts, but we have to juxtapose that with the idea of substantial change, and substantial change in which an active organism that's interacting with an expectable environment, because you will encounter objects that you can manipulate, is going to occur. Okay, so moving along, I have less to say about perspective taking, and then I'll move to spatial reorientation. Perspective taking is interesting, not just in terms of strong starting points and major change, but in terms of parsing the mind. Because if you think about it computationally, mental rotation and perspective taking are the same. Either you turn the object, or maybe you walk around it. You turn the array, or maybe you walk around it. But in terms of what you can really do in the world, remember that objects are things you can hold in the hand, and that's what you mostly turn. Objects in an array that you turn on a turntable are kind of the exception to the rule. You've had to make a device to enable yourself to turn them all at once. So mental rotation, I would argue, is something that you do with objects, that you do with your hand. Whereas perspective taking is something you do with your feet when you walk around the environment and you view it from different vantage points, as in a three mountains kind of task. And there's a good deal of support for this. Despite being computationally equivalent, mental rotation and perspective taking tasks turn out to be behaviorally dissociable, which I won't unpack for you. I just gave you a few references here. They also are neurally unique, which I think is really interesting. And Lambrey, Taylor, Bertos, and Neil Burgess did this, I think, lovely study in which in a virtual world, you see objects on this kind of table that you can imagine turning, and you're told either to imagine it turning or to imagine walking around it. And if you're imagining walking around it, you engage navigational bits of your brain like retrosplenial complex and hippocampus. And if you're imagining rotating it, then you do not engage those areas. Instead, you engage areas like intraparietal sulcus. So we see this distinction, and we therefore parse perspective taking is related to navigation, and mental rotation is related to object skills. Now, recently, Maria Brucato and Andrea Frick again, and Alina Nazareth and I have done some work on the various ways of assessing perspective taking. And there's 4 different tests. There's actually more, but we picked 4 of them. And we did item response theory analyses to isolate the best items. The 4 mountains test, which Tom Hartley built when he was in the Neil Burgess lab, actually didn't work out very well from a psychometric point of view. The other 3 tests have some good items and some bad items. We were able to dissociate perspective taking from mental rotation after controlling for IQ and working memory, only when we took sort of the good items. And I'm mentioning this because psychometrics often is seen as really, really boring. I think to make progress in research, we're going to have to really bite the bullet of refining our measures. But it also supports this idea of dissociability. Now, active perspective taking is important because we can then make judgments that we can't make if we're imagining or viewing array rotation. So this is an experiment that appeared a couple of years ago with Corinne Holmes as the lead author. I won't tell you much about it except to draw your attention to the blue bars, in which we showed that either if you walk around, or actually if you're pushed in a chair by an experimenter. This was a kind of demanding experiment for the experimenter because they had to push the person in the chair around the display. You can judge what the global array should look like. You know how the bits relate to each other. You can't do that if you are rotating the table or having the table rotated for you. So famously, Piaget said that perspective taking appeared late, not till 9 or 10 years. John Flavel argued back in the 1970s that it wasn't quite true. There were level 1 tasks, as he called them, that children can do, which are basically line of sight tasks. If you draw a line from another person's eyes to something, does it or doesn't it go through a solid object? If it goes through a solid object, then they can't see it. If it doesn't go through a solid object, they can see it. And one way to judge this is, does the child show you a book facing himself or facing you? And this is actually a picture of my grandson showing a mask book when he was only about 18 months age, so that it faced the observer. So even little kids can do that. Level 2 tasks are ones in which they have to work out in more detail exactly what the other person sees, and that's what's indexed by the 3 mountains task. Now, a long time ago, but not in the 1970s, Jane Ellen Huttenlocher and I showed that children as young as 4 could succeed if you asked them, if you were sitting, say, in Piaget's chair, actually we had a doll in the chair, not Piaget, what mountain would be in front or what mountain would be behind. They could say the light green one, the dark green one, whatever, which is not the way Piaget tested it. Instead, the way Piaget tested it would be to do something like, again, Andrea Frick, Venki Murray, and I did in constructing a test, a psychometric test that you can give to kids of what another observer would see. So if you have these little dolls, what would you see from this perspective? What would you see from this perspective? And you're given 4 choices of what the 4 possibilities are. And this is much more difficult than answering a question, because you have to distinguish in the conflicting frame of reference of the surrounding room, which is the one that you would see. And when you do that, when you do what Piaget did, and this is very often the case when you try to do what Piaget did, you find, and just draw your attention to the 90-degree graph here, your 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6, 7, 8-year-old, here's 0. I mean, doing abysmally terribly with 1, 2, or 4 objects, or even worse, with a kick up between 7 and 8. So it really is late if you have to deal with conflicting frames of reference, which sometimes, of course, you have to do. I want to just briefly mention, because everyone always asks me about sex differences. We don't really know about sex differences in perspective taking. There's no meta-analysis of kids. My impression is that sex differences are very rarely found, though, in children, in child samples. But there do seem to be some differences in adults. But there's no meta-analysis, even in adults, on perspective taking tests. For navigation skills, there are some differences we showed in a recent meta-analysis, but they're fairly small. At least they're much smaller than the ones for mental rotation. And they do appear over developmental time, just as the mental rotation ones appear. So I'll just draw your attention to this blue bracket from non-existent, a 0 effect size, up to about 0.2, but the median effect size is about 0.13 or something for children less than 13 years of age. So perspective taking, I think, although I've given you less evidence, also shows some strong starts. You can do level 1 perspective taking. You can do level 2 perspective taking in a supportive environment with a single question that minimizes conflicting frames of reference by 4, but you take till at least 8, really 9, 10, and then there are major differences in adults, individual differences in adults, at doing perspective taking in challenging situations. So with that, I want to go on to the last of my examples, which is spatial reorientation. And this addresses both how we parse the mind, what bits go into the mind, and are they modular, and also head-on addresses the issue of modern versions of nativism in the core knowledge perspective that's advocated by Liz Spelke. So Fodor famously talked about modularity of mind, and the core knowledge perspective suggests that geometric relations are one of what Spelke and Kinsler list as 5 areas of core knowledge. And what Spelke means by this is this hypothesis of a geometric module, which is the idea that there's geometric information in the surrounding world of boundaries that guides how you reorient if you are disoriented, if you're spun around and made dizzy. So animals in these experiments, like this is actually a stuffed mouse, but you do lots of experiments with real rodents, are spun around, or children are gently spun around, perhaps while singing Ring Around a Rosie. How do they look for something that has been hidden in one of the 4 corners when there are identical things, boxes to choose from in each of the 4 corners? And what's been found with rodents, and what Linda Hermer and Liz Spelke found in the 90s, is that if there is no distinguishing marks on the wall, and it's all white, and there's a long wall and a long wall, a short wall and a short wall, they will evenly divide their searches between the correct corner, C, where the long wall is to the left of the short wall, and the reversal corner where the same is true, as they should, because how would you choose after you've been disoriented? But additionally, that they continue to do that, or in this particular data set, even do more of the reverse, even when a red wall has been added, which should allow them to succeed. And so from that, they argued for encapsulation, which is the hallmark of modularity, and which is therefore, in a nativist view, what is innate. This is representational nativism. Now, adults do not do that. Adults do, with exception of this possibly hungover Cornell student, because this was not Cornell back in the day, do go to the correct corner. So what Spelke has advocated as an explanation for the change, which she thinks occurs at about the age of 5 or 6, between an encapsulated geometric module and this adult flexibility, is the idea of language. If you're a representational nativist, if you're a core knowledge theorist, you need something to account for developmental change. So they've typically gone with language, and specifically with words left and right. And there is some evidence for this. There's some correlational evidence, there's some training evidence, and there's also evidence from a linguistic shadowing tasks. Even adults can't use those features. Those red walls are called features, if they're concurrently having to shadow someone reading the New York Times to them over headphones. So that looks pretty powerful. But with Amy Learmonth and Jane Ellen Huttenlocher, I showed that these red walls, these featural cues, are only neglected in tiny rooms. What I have not told you is that the Hermer-Spelke rooms were only, I'm going to use 4 feet by 6 feet, and I know most of you probably used metric, but it's a very small room. This was an 8 by 12 foot room, which is 4 times the area, and they succeeded there. And we actually replicated that, Amy and me, on her postdoc with Lynn Nadell, in a room with movable walls. So everything was really incredibly well controlled. And 4-year-olds did not use features in the small room, and they did use features in the large room. And adults, if you make them conflicted, if you train them in a small room and then switch them to a large room, or one way, the opposite, do large room and then go to the small room, you can draw their attention to geometry or draw their attention to features, and then they'll transfer it to the other room when you go back to it. We've also shown that features can be true reorientation cues. This debate got really convoluted, as debates often do, and there was the thought that, well, you still have the long wall left of the short wall and there's something red, and the long wall left of the short wall, but there's not anything red. So we did an experiment in an octagonal room with 1 red wall, where the task is to distinguish among the 3 remaining all white corners that have the same geometric characteristics. And we found that children as young as 3 years could do that. So features are true reorientation cues. This is just another finding. We also redid the verbal shadowing experiment with spatial shadowing and found that anything that takes your attention off of where exactly the toy or keys or whatever was being hidden was hidden, once your attention is taken off of it, you are impaired in your ability to go to the correct corner. Although we did not find adults at chance, but we did find adults doing much less well than they should be doing. We have also shown in one experiment, and there's a similar finding from Twyman, Spetz, and Friedman, that if you train young children to use features and then switch them, they will use features. This is basically like the finding with Ratliff, that if you start adults in the larger room, they're more likely to use the features in the smaller room. If you start them in the smaller room, vice versa. So the environment is having an impact. I already told you about this. Then there's this experiment, the only time in my life I've really worked with non-human animals, because Alex Twyman came to do a doctorate with me after some experience at the University of Alberta working with animals. So we did a mouse experiment where we did what you can't do with human children, which is we reared little mice together with their mother, because otherwise they would die, in either a round environment or a rectangular environment. And then after 2 months of living in those environments, we put them into the geometric module situation. And we found that if you're reared in the rectangular environment, you use geometry. Remember, we rear rodents in cages. We rear human babies in rectangular rooms. But what happens in circles? The circle-reared mice are at chance. They do not use geometry. Having not been exposed to geometry, they don't use geometry. There's always somebody in the question period who says, oh, why don't you study babies born in yurts? I don't know, I guess we could do that. I don't know how many babies are reared in yurts these days, or if I can actually go test them. But that's the basic idea. You need exposure to this information to be able to learn to use it. So recently with Terry Regier and Young Shu, I've proposed a combinatorial Bayesian model that can explain a large swath of the infant, child, adult reorientation data, which takes us back to that kind of Bayesian theme. And then Randy Gallistel, who kind of is a nativist, but who doubts the Spelke hypothesis, has really situated the geometric module work in the arena of evolutionary advantages. From that point of view, it doesn't seem that having a geometric module would offer evolutionary advantages. Remember, we did not grow up as a species in a carpentered environment. We've only had a carpentered environment recently. So landmarks need to be back on the cognitive map. Dina Liu pointed this out. You have trees, and sometimes you don't have many trees, and they all kind of look alike. And yes, you might have a boundary like this cliff outcropping, but it's only really on one side, and it's kind of irregular. So when we think about navigation and disorientation and reorientation, we need really to think about landmarks, not only about geometric enclosures. So I've skimmed over this because it is a long and arcane theoretical argument, as these things often get to be, but it was, I think, an important dispute to have with the person, Liz Spelke, who arguably is the leading proponent of core knowledge nativism today. So that was modern nativism and massive modularity and core knowledge, and my problems with at least one version of that in a nutshell. So in closing, I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation, which funded almost all of the research that I've told you about, especially through the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center, which I was proud to head from 2006 until funding, as it was always planned this way, came to an end in 2018. But I also want to take the time to mention Jane Ellen Huttenlocher, who I only did some of the studies that I presented today. I've only did a few of those with her, but she was a lifelong collaborator. I still mourn her loss, and I treasure the time actually that we did spend together in Berlin with some other spatial cognition folks at the Wissenschaftskolleg. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora, for such an inspiring talk. And now we would like to open the Q&A. If people have questions, you can indicate in the chat feature. Okay, we do have a question. Let me navigate. Oh, Marcus, I believe that you might have a question. I think your mic is on.
Okay. Thank you, Nora, for this great lecture. I guess a crucial point here is that spatial abilities and are so so basic to our way of thinking. There's now this idea that the cognition itself may be structured in this geometrical world, that you do not only use this geometrical system in your mind to organize orientation in the world, but so that you also may use it for orientation in object spaces or in categorical spaces. How do you think is this development in spatial orientation in the beginning a prerequisite for organizing the remainder part of our cognitive life?
Right. I think you're talking about the use of the term cognitive map to apply to sort of concept maps and sort of semantic knowledge, as well as about literal spatial layout. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, this is what I was referring to.
Yeah,
map
Tim Barron's and so on and so forth. Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting because a lot of people are very enamored of the idea of the conceptual cognitive map, and I think there are data that favor it. But there are people who don't believe there are even literal spatial cognitive maps. Instead, they think that spatial knowledge is merely associationistic, or comes in the form of a graph, a cognitive graph, maybe a labeled cognitive graph. So this is another area that quickly becomes pretty complicated. In fact, with Russ Epstein and Eva Brunick and Michael Pierce, we've recently written an overview of cognitive maps versus cognitive graphs, which is actually another major theoretical controversy that I somehow got embroiled in. Bill Warren at Brown University is the current big proponent of there are no such thing as the cognitive maps. The best we can have is a labeled graph. And so again, it's gotten actually fairly convoluted. We're trying to argue for the position that you can have both, and that to some extent it depends on the environments, to some extent it depends on individual differences, and that you can even have both at the same time in coexistence because they probably depend on different parts of the brain. So from that point of view, I think it probably, well, it could be the case that Tim Barron's is right and that we also use this kind of system to organize conceptual knowledge. But let's put it this way, I remain to be persuaded. I think it's an idea that's very much in vogue, and there's some evidence in favor of it, but we don't know enough yet to be confident that it's correct, and we know almost nothing about it in development.
Thank you.
Okay, and next in line, we have Lemberger.
Hi, Nora.
Hi.
Thanks for this great talk. I have a question about something that I know little about or haven't studied much, namely motivation and interest. And the reason why I'm asking is if more than would be assumed by a neo-nativist perspective comes about through action and through engagement with the world. And if it is the case that some of the group differences that we see seem to increase over time, then one may ask oneself whether the driver of these differences is not so much a difference in aptitude that might be present from the very start, but perhaps differential interest in engaging with certain aspects of the world. So that, and now I'm perhaps just repeating a stereotype, that perhaps, for instance, some of the gender differences are due to the fact that the gender differ I mean, on average, we never talk about individuals, in the aspect of reality they just like to engage with. And then, of course, also make more, gain more relevant experience with that aspect of reality. So I think my general question is whether there is a place for differences in domain-specific interests as a driver of individual differences.
Right. So with respect to sex differences in especially mental rotation, which have been the best researched, this often comes down to the claim that boy babies are more object-oriented and girl babies are more people-oriented. And although I guess you could sort of mentally rotate people, it sort of doesn't seem to be, and you certainly can't rotate them in your hand. So this could be why ultimately adult women are better at reading nonverbal facial expressions and nonverbal sort of body poses and so forth, because they're paying attention to people, and mental rotation is an object skill. I think a lot of the theories, and that is one of them, are appealing, as you point out, in part because they appeal to stereotypes that we hold. When you probe what the evidence for them is, they almost all get a lot shakier. So one of the recent findings that I think is pretty interesting, well, let me back up. You might think that because there's sex differences in mental rotation and sex differences in navigation, that whatever is driving one is driving the other, despite one being larger and the other being a little more moderate. The same thing as stereotypes, interest are driving both. But in a recent paper with sort of hunter-gatherer society, Elizabeth Cashton and some of her co-workers have found that the differences in navigation are largely driven by how much of the environment you sort of explore. They actually had GPS devices on these people, going around their jungle areas and so forth. And those diverge as the boys and girls get a little older for two reasons. One is because the girls are considered more likely, and perhaps are actually more likely, to be harmed if they stray too far. And also, I believe the boys are more likely to go to to do some of the sort of hunting activities that require you to range more widely. So, but on the other hand, the mental rotation seems to be exacerbated by going to school, which some of them do. So there are different specific drivers of each of them. So this is not to say that that's an alternative theory. It's to say that in this one small study of this one small group, we started to do what I think we're going to have to really do much more of, which is to take a real look at real mechanisms with real input data in order to be able to tell these various theories apart.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. And next we have Birgit Elsner. And I believe your mic is on.
Okay, thanks, Nora, for this great and very interesting talk. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you. So I'm working on the precursors of mental perspective taking in infancy. And I think there's some evidence that the capacity for mental perspective taking, like false belief understanding, is related to the capacity of spatial perspective taking. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. Especially what intrigues me about this relation is that, as you say, the males are a bit better in the spatial perspective taking, but the mental perspective taking seems to be a bit better in the females. So
Yeah.
how can this relation then be explained? So what are your thoughts about that?
Right. This is actually what Maria Brocado is currently working on. So some people do think that they're related. And actually, there's three kinds of perspective taking. There's this visual or spatial perspective taking. There's cognitive perspective taking, like what are you thinking, or where do you think the candy was hidden? And there's sort of affective perspective taking. Are you disappointed you don't know where the candy was hidden, or what are you feeling? And perspective taking is a term we use for all of them, but there's remarkably little definitive evidence about how related they are. Some of the tasks that we use for cognitive perspective taking are actually pretty spatial, like this director's task, where there's a bank of toys and some of them are obscured to a person on the other side, and you have to describe what's there so that a person on the other side can pick things up. Well, I couldn't even describe this without moving my hands. So is that about taking the other person's cognitive perspective or the other person's spatial perspective? So if you try to disambiguate them and make clearly different tasks, you both in terms of correlational data and in terms of sort of neural substrate data, you can find pieces of evidence that support the relationship among all three of these, or maybe spatial is distinct from cognitive affective, or maybe cognitive needs to be divided into the more spatial ones and put with spatial, and the less spatial ones maybe go with affective. So I think it's fascinating work, but part of me wishes they weren't all called perspective taking, because I will say that my hunch, except I could be wrong, is that they're mainly related by the demands they make on attention. And in fact, you do find attentional areas of the brain activated when you do all three kinds of things, because you have to suppress how you feel, how you think, what you see in order to take the other perspective. But aside from that, I'm not sure. Maybe, you may have evidence differently, though. I really am kind of open on this.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's still something that definitely needs more research, especially exploring the underlying mechanisms of this relation. So maybe it's just about some general cognitive ability that is related to both mental and spatial perspective taking, because, as you said, it's a theoretical debate. So exploring the mechanism and explaining these kinds of correlational evidence that we have.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, let me know what you find.
Okay, thanks.
Great. And up next we have Yara Halou. Your mic is now on.
Yes, thanks Nora for the very interesting talk. So my question, in your opinion, do you think there is a relation between the development of a spatial orientation capabilities and also the emergence of some spatial phobias like height, flying, I don't know, claustrophobias and things like this. And since I got unmuted, so a very quick second question: are there like special procedures to start training children at different ages for improving their perspective taking as well as their like mental rotation abilities? Thanks.
Okay. Well, the first one, the small room that Hermer and Spelke used actually is kind of claustrophobia inducing. I will say that it's really pretty small. There's that. I don't know though. I think Stella Lorenko may have done at Emory University, may have done a little work on the first question that you asked, but I don't myself know the answer to it. In terms of the second, I'm so glad you asked, because that's a whole other colloquium I could give. I very much think that there are experiences that do foster the development of mental rotation and the development of perspective taking. And that relates to Ulman's question in terms of where you get the sex differences from. So David Utall and I and several other people did a meta-analysis at this point quite a long time ago that appeared in Psych Bulletin that showed that you could train mental rotation and you can train perspective taking in kids as well as in adults. This is not one of those do it early or forget about it kind of critical period phenomenon. In fact, the effect sizes for training were equal across that time span. There were hints that the kids maybe you could train a little bit more, but it wasn't significant. Now, that said, I think that the training that people gave in the studies that we combined for the meta-analysis were often very primitive. They were sometimes just practice, or somebody thought, oh, have play Tetris, wouldn't that be cool? They weren't kind of targeted interventions. And I think over the intervening decade or so, we've gotten better at thinking about, for instance, spatial language and language in conjunction with block play, language in conjunction with puzzle play, especially for mental rotation. And there's starting to be work that's not just correlational with a longitudinal sample, but even interventional, even true experimentation that Marianella Casasola at Cornell has done, that's suggesting that those kinds of drivers do indeed drive improvement and may drive sex differences. I mean, that we don't know yet. And that are uniquely appropriate at different developmental periods. So there's certain kinds of spatial language that a little kid won't know, that an older kid will know. So, you know, gauging what you do when to just, like Vygotskian idea, I told you I was eclectic, to be in that zone of proximal development as you help and support a child in ratcheting up that developmental sequence. I think is really, really important.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting and exciting also to follow up on. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot to do.
Thank you.
Okay, and the next one is from Carol Rowland, and I would read this question. Thank you, Nora, great talk. You mentioned that you agree with Ellen and Smith that qualitative shifts only look qualitative from a distance, but Piaget definitely saw a role of accommodation in which the child made periodic qualitative leaps in thinking, which moved them from one stage to another. Have you seen evidence of such qualitative leaps in your work?
No. So here's the thing. I believe in accommodation. I mean, that's the idea of cognitive dissonance. That's the idea of prediction error, which is, you know, a very sort of in vogue concept in theorizing today. There's different ways you can talk about that, and I very much believe it. But accommodation of a structural stage is the weakest part in my estimation of Piaget's theory. And when some people say Piaget is old hat, forget about Piaget, I think they're going way too far, because I believe in the active child. I believe in the early experience of motor experience, early effective motor experience. and so on and so forth. I believe in dissonance reduction, but the evidence for structurally related cohesive stages is just not there. That was what people did endlessly through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You just push the ages from older to younger to whatever, and this goes together and that doesn't go together, and no, it just doesn't work. We're just gonna, I think, have to say Piaget was a great guy, he had some good ideas, these ones panned out, these didn't, that's done.
Okay, thank you. And up next we have Mi-Sun Kim. Mi-Sun, can you? Okay, maybe I'm just gonna read the question out loud in this case. For mental rotation of objects, is it possible that some people rotate objects in 3D so that they don't distinguish mirror symmetric objects? Maybe mental rotation does not necessarily be restricted to rotation on a 2D plane.
Oh yeah, no, some mental rotation tests are in the plane, they're two-dimensional, and those are easier. And lots of them are three-dimensional, which are harder. Now, they're harder partly because you're typically looking at a 2D representation of a three-dimensional structure, which itself is then something that you have to interpret. Although occasionally, not enough probably, mental rotation experiments have been done with really actually present, actually three-dimensional objects. The principles apply to both. You can have, so to speak, mirror images in 3D as well as into 2D, as well as in 2D, which is actually what those block structures are. So there was something else I was going to say about this, but now I forgot. Yeah, no, anyway, it's not just 2D, sorry. I shouldn't have given that impression. Oh, I know. There are also different axes of rotation. So especially in 3 dimensions, you can imagine, you know, this kind of rotation or this kind of, or that kind of rotation. There's all sorts of unorthodox axes of rotation. And what Patricia Carpenter and Marcel Just showed a long time ago, I think in the mid 80s, is that people who test higher on mental rotation tests are more able to rotate around unorthodox axes of rotation, other than the 3 major axes.
Thanks. Okay, and next on the list is Yili Xing. Yili, can you, we're not hearing you. Oh, your mic is on.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello, Nora. Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. I'll also take this chance to say a warm hello to my friends and former colleagues in Berlin. Hello, everybody. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about studies, for example, from Stahl and Feigenson, where they talked about violations of expectations that may come from, you know, violating core knowledge. Now, I understand that you are very perhaps skeptical of the idea of the core knowledge, but I wonder if that kind of work can sort of be the bridge between, you know, a complete nativist view and a more empiricist, sort of more constructive constructivism view, perhaps. Yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's really a fascinating idea. I think that Lisa Feigenson has actually not quite, I don't know, I'm psychoanalyzing Lisa. I think she hasn't quite realized the implications of that work, because it could be a bridge between those two, you know, points of view, theoretical points of view. But what you then have to ask, and this is from the point of view of you need to analyze input, how often would those kinds of things happen in the real world of the real baby. So they do experiments in which that's been engineered, and they find that babies do react to it and do learn from it. The question in my mind is, could this actually be an engine of change in the real world, where we have to know more about input, if that makes sense? So here's another way to think about this. And this idea comes from Esther Thielen and Linda Smith. Another thing that I thought was amazing in their book that they point out about the infancy experiments is that whether we do habituation or just violation of expectation, but even if we only do violation of expectation, we show kids this and this again, and this again, and this a fourth time, and maybe a fifth time. And if we habituate, it could be like 12 times. So we give them what, from some points of view, is a teaching, a really powerful again and again and again teaching sequence. So the question doesn't become, oh, babies are so smart, they know this. Maybe what we're finding is that babies are smart enough that if you teach them really, really a lot and you test them right away, what you're showing is they learned something, maybe only for 5 seconds, but they were able to hold on to it for that long. So we kind of don't know, because the whole literature on infancy has mainly never been done with the following control. Although I once did it. I've only done a few infant experiments in my life because they're very frustrating and they take forever. But what you need to do is to show babies through magic a sequence of things that can't happen in the real world, that don't happen in the real world. So you try to teach them the wrong thing about the world. And then the question is, do they learn the wrong thing about the world? Now, in the thing that I did, which is, do they know if it disappears here, it has to come out here, it can't possibly come out here, which is a pretty strong thing to be violating, even when the babies are only 4 or 5 months old. If we systematically show them, goes in here, comes out here, goes in here, comes out here, they're like, what? I don't think so. So in this instance, we actually, I think, did show some support for a pretty strong start. But this control is almost never done in infancy work. So that's a little bit of a backhanded way of utterly agreeing with you about the Feigenson work, and then just saying we need to take it a step further.
Thank you, Nora. Including this next question, we will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Including this next question, we have 3 more questions. Yes. And this next one is from Mariana Kapsataki, and I will read the question. They thank you for the talk. And regarding the 4 mountain task, do you think that this task tests mental rotation or perspective taking? And they're asking because the scale is small, like object-like, the mountains on the screen or on A4 paper, but in real life, one would need to walk around mountains.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, the claim is that it assesses perspective taking, but I don't know what it assesses, I guess, because it turned out to have such weird psychometric characteristics that I don't know if it's a really good test at all. And I feel bad saying this because, you know, Tom Hartley and Neil Burgess do great work, and they have shown that their test is sensitive to certain specific kinds of brain damage that, by the way, ought to affect real perspective taking, not mental rotation. So speculatively, I think maybe it does work psychometrically for samples that aren't your kind of normal young adult college sample. So I don't want to just say it's a useless test. But the reason it may assess perspective taking, at least in those populations that actually are having trouble, is that, remember from the experiment also out of the Burgess lab, Lambrey et al., that was done with the MRI technology, it's not about whether you're really walking or really moving your hand, it's about what you're imagining yourself doing. So if you're imagining yourself walking through the mountains, you may be invoking, this is the whole, actually, Piagetian idea of interiorization of action, doing within yourself the same thing you would be doing if you were walking through real mountains. So that actually is what I think it potentially is tapping it, but not well for a normal population.
Thanks, Nora. And next we have Xiangbin Tang, and I would read out this question. Are there studies on mental rotation on people with congenital blindness?
I feel like there must be, because, yeah, I'm pretty sure. In fact, I think Gloria Marmer did this. Oh man, I knew there was. It was a long time ago. Yeah, Marmer did this before she left the field. I don't know, she became an investment banker or something. But yeah, you do show those sort of same, so you manually explore, obviously, and you show those same kinds of linear relationships with angular disparity. In general, I would say if you're tempted to use the term visuospatial, don't. Because for normal sighted individuals, space is very visual, just because humans are such visual animals. But again and again, what we find in blind individuals is that a lot, I mean, not all, because it is hard if you don't have vision, but a lot of what we see in the spatial domain with sighted individuals is very similar in blind individuals. So it's about layout, it's not about seeing.
Okay. And then up next, we have a question from Christiane Lange-Kuttner. And your microphone.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
I can.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you so very much for your talk. I have a question that relates to one of your best cited articles in spatial cognition, I think, Huttenlocher, Newcombe, and Sandberg in 1994, about the coding of spatial location in young children, where a toy was dug into a sandbox, and then the younger children would just encode a prototype, and the older children would impose some sort of segmentation on the whole spatial array. And at the time, that was a fairly straightforward result, and there's two levels of coding of location. But with hindsight now, would you still give the same explanation? You've done so much also recently on brain processes and children, and I just wonder whether you would have, for this very classic study, a different explanation now with having a second look at it.
Yeah, no, I still, I mean, again, that's a whole other talk on an adaptive combination approach to thinking about spatial development. And in fact, the model of the spatial reorientation phenomena that I did with, you know, the Schuh-Regier and Newcombe is an adaptive combination approach. The categorical sort of, the combination of categorical and fine-grained information is another instance of adaptive combination. Now, there are alternative perspectives on that. So John Spencer was for a while advancing a dynamic systems approach that he took to be different. I actually, that was a funny controversy. I've been involved in several, as you could tell, controversies in my life. But the difference I had with John Spencer was a funny one, because I actually thought that what he said was very much in line with the Huttenlocher et al. Approach, but he didn't realize that, which actually made him mad, because I was sort of saying, but you're on our side. He said, no, I'm not. And then there's recently been some work, which I think isn't out yet, from Tom Griffiths, although it's with adults, that takes a different approach to some of the phenomena that would be predicted by the Huttenlocher et al. Model, which I hasten to add is not only for space, it's also for time, it's also for category knowledge. It was originally proposed with Larry Hedges. I wasn't really even on lots of the papers. But yeah, that's a long-winded answer to what you asked, which is, do I still stand by it? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, okay. What about the neo-Piagetian F factor for field factor?
Sorry, the neo-Piagetian what?
The F factor for field factor, you know that?
Yeah, you mean Juan Pascual-Leone?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, well, you know, it just was never very well specified. I mean, it was this idea that there's just sort of general executive, you know, executive control, attention. I mean, he didn't call it that because he was writing back when we didn't really have those terms. And yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, of course. But various people like Graham Halford in Australia have tried to use that to
That's right.
sort of reconstitute Piaget. But I think it always has run into the problem of making non-circular predictions. And I don't think it's ever dealt effectively with that. Eventually, those kinds of domain general mechanisms are definitely going to need to be part of our account of cognitive development. But I don't think they right now sit easily with these more domain specific accounts.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nora. And next we have Christine Winbichler. Your mic
Thank you. Yes, thank you. This is not a question. I just would like to thank you, Nora, and the organizers of this event on behalf of the Baltes Foundation and the Baltes family. And it may be amusing for you to hear that once I gave Paul Baltes a Piaget wristwatch for his birthday, and it's the same family, the watchmakers and the psychologist. So thank you. Thanks a lot.
That was quite a present you gave him.
It was. He was impressed.
Good.
Great. And on that lovely note, if I may suggest that we pause this exciting discussion here. We are so grateful to have you with us virtually, Nora. And before we end, I just want to express our gratitude to Silke Schäfer for organizational and technical assistance, and Jürgen Rosbach for the graphical design of the invitation. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And stay safe and healthy.
Too early here to have a glass of wine, but I'll lift my mug of tea to you.
Thanks, Nora.
Okay, bye.
It was wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nora. Bye.
Thank you.